Hi lovelies, welcome back to Vintage Mike Tales. Thank you so much for being here, and for choosing to spend a few moments of your day with me. Your love, support, and constant presence mean more than I can ever put into words. If you're new here, you're truly welcome. Now settle in, relax, and let's get into today's story. The nightmare always started the same way. Steve Douglas stood in a park he couldn't quite place. Autumn leaves swirling around his feet. A girl waved at him from across the basketball court. He couldn't see her face clearly, but something about her made his chest ache. She was calling his name, reaching for him, and he was running toward her. But the distance between them never closed. He woke gasping, his Manhattan penthouse bedroom bathed in pre-dawn gray. 35 years old, a business empire at his fingertips, and he couldn't sleep through a single night. Without dreaming of a ghost he couldn't remember, Steve pressed his palms against his eyes. His sandy brown hair was damp with sweat, his heart racing like he'd actually been running. The dreams had started 9 months ago, right after his Uncle Richard died, and they were getting worse. More vivid, more desperate. His phone buzzed. 6:47 a.m., another day of pretending he was fine. "Mr. Douglas, are you with us?" Steve blinked, realizing the entire boardroom was staring at him. 12 faces, waiting for his response to a question he hadn't heard. His CFO, David Chen, had that look again, concerned, frustrated, worried. "I apologize," Steve said, straightening in his chair. His blue eyes, usually sharp and commanding, felt unfocused. "Could you repeat that?" David exchanged glances with the others. "Steve, maybe we should take a break. I'm fine." The words came out harder than he intended. Continue, but he wasn't fine. His mind kept drifting to the dream, to that park, to the feeling that he'd forgotten something crucial, something that mattered more than quarterly projections and acquisition deals. The meeting dragged on. Steve approved budgets he barely read, signed off on proposals he didn't fully process. He was there, but he wasn't really there. Everyone could see it. That evening, Steve sat across from Vanessa Chen at Per Se, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. She was beautiful, elegant in a black dress, intelligent, successful. Exactly the kind of woman he should want. But as she talked about her latest case, some corporate merger dispute, Steve found himself staring past her at the window, at the city lights. And nothing. "Steve," Vanessa set down her wine glass. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Disappearing." Her voice was kind but firm. "You're physically here, but you're not really here. You haven't been present for any of our dates." She reached across the table, squeezed his hand. "I like you. I really do. But I'm not going to compete with whatever ghost is haunting you." Steve opened his mouth to protest, to apologize, to explain something he didn't understand himself. But Vanessa was already standing, gathering her purse. "Figure out what you're running from," she said softly. "Or what you're running toward. But don't waste my time or yours, pretending you're available when your heart clearly belongs to someone else." She left him sitting alone at a table set for two, surrounded by the city's elite, feeling more isolated than he'd ever felt in his life. The truth was, she wasn't the first woman to say it. There had been others over the years, beautiful, intelligent women who'd walked away because Steve was always searching for something. Someone, a ghost he couldn't name. 20 years ago, the Chicago park was Jessica Williams' bedroom, her refuge, her hiding place. At 13, she'd learned that park benches were safer than the foster home she'd run from 3 days ago. Her deep brown skin was smudged with dirt. Her natural curls matted, but her warm brown eyes were alert, always watching, always ready. She woke to the sound of cruel laughter. 3 older boys, maybe 16 or 17, were circling someone by the basketball court. A younger boy with sandy brown hair and bright blue eyes stood frozen, his backpack torn open, books scattered across the concrete. "Please," the boy was saying, his voice shaking. "Just leave me alone." "Please," one of the bullies mimicked, shoving him hard. "What are you going to do about it, crybaby?" Jessica was on her feet before she made the conscious decision to move. 13 years of survival had taught her when to hide and when to fight. This was a fight moment. "Leave him alone." Her voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The bullies turned, surprise registering on their faces. A small black girl, homeless by the look of her, challenging them. "Who's this?" "His little girlfriend." "I said leave. Him. Alone." Jessica planted herself between them and the boy, her small frame radiating a fierceness that made even the biggest one hesitate. "Get out of the way, little girl, or you'll regret it." "Make me." It happened fast. The biggest one grabbed for her, and Jessica's fist connected with his nose. Blood spurted. His friend lunged and she kicked hard, but there were three of them. A fist caught her shoulder, spinning her. She kept fighting, kept swinging, protecting the boy behind her even as sharp. Searing pain exploded across her left wrist. Jessica looked down and saw blood, so much blood streaming from a deep gash. One of them had a knife. The world tilted, colors bleeding together. "Jesus!" one of the bullies shouted. They scattered like roaches, running. Jessica fell to her knees, clutching her wrist. The boy she'd saved dropped beside her, his blue eyes wide with absolute horror. Oh God," he was saying, pulling off his jacket and pressing it against her wound. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold pressure. "Help! Someone help! I'm okay," Jessica heard herself say through the pain. Blood was soaking through his jacket, warm and sticky. "Stop crying. I'll be okay." But the boy, 15 years old, she'd later learn named Steve, was sobbing like his heart was breaking. "This is my fault. You're hurt because of me. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." "Not your fault," Jessica managed. An older woman was running toward them, phone already out. "You're safe. That's what matters." The ambulance arrived in a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Steve wouldn't let go of her hand, even when the paramedics tried to move him aside. "Where are you taking her?" "Which hospital?" "Northwestern," one of them said, lifting Jessica onto a gurney. Jessica tried to smile at him through her pain. "Go home, your parents will worry." "I don't care," Steve said fiercely, and something in his voice, the raw determination, the guilt, the gratitude, made Jessica believe him. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Steve stood in the parking lot covered in her blood and whispered a promise to the air. "I'll find you. I'll come see you. I promise." 3 hours later, Steve Douglas walked into Northwestern Hospital, sweating and out of breath, his bicycle helmet still on his head. "I'm looking for a girl," he told the nurse at the desk. 13. Brought in this morning, cut on her wrist. The nurse's expression softened. "The Jane Doe?" "Room 347. Are you family?" Steve nodded, lying without hesitation. He found Jessica in a bed too big for her small frame, her left wrist wrapped in white bandages, her eyes closed. Steve stood in the doorway, guilt crushing his chest until she opened her eyes. "You came," she whispered, surprise and something else, hope flickering across her face. "I rode 15 miles, Steve said, moving to her bedside. "Are you okay? Does it hurt?" Jessica smiled weakly. 14 stitches. "But I'm okay." Steve came every day after that, sometimes on his bike, pedaling the 15 miles until his legs burned, sometimes walking when his father noticed the bike missing and locked it up. He brought her snacks from vending machines, told her about his school, made her laugh when the pain was bad. She told him about foster homes, about running, about learning to survive. He told her about his mother dying last year, about his father who worked all the time and barely saw him anymore. "Why did you help me?" Steve asked on the 5th day. "You didn't even know me." Jessica looked at her bandaged wrist. "Because nobody helped me when I needed it. I wanted to be different." On the 10th day, Steve's eyes were red when he arrived, his hands shaking. "My uncle is taking me to New York tomorrow. My dad, he can't take care of me. I have to go tomorrow." Jessica's voice cracked. "I don't want to." Steve was crying now, pulling a small box from his pocket. "This was my mom's. It's all I have left of her." He opened it, a silver necklace with a tiny star pendant. "But I want you to have it, so you remember me, so you know I'm coming back." "Steve, I can't. Promise me you'll keep it," he said desperately. "Promise me you'll wait for me. I'm going to come back to Chicago for you, Jessica. When I'm older, when I can choose. I promise. I'll find you." Through tears, Jessica promised. She let him clasp the necklace around her neck, felt the silver settle against her skin like a vow. "I promise too," she whispered. "I'll wait for you." They were two kids making promises they had no power to keep, binding themselves with words and silver and blood. Steve left the next morning for New York, looking back at the hospital until it disappeared from view, not knowing it would be 20 years before he remembered the girl who'd saved him. Present day. Jessica Williams sat in her UNICEF office, staring at her computer screen without seeing it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but all she could hear was Kingsley's voice from last night. "You're too good to be deceived, Jessica. I tried to feel the same spark, but the connection is gone. I'm sorry. Another one. Another good man who tried to love her and couldn't. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her neck, fingers finding the silver necklace she never removed. The star pendant was warm against her caramel-brown skin, worn smooth from 20 years of constant touch. She didn't even realize she was doing it anymore. This ritual of seeking comfort from a promise made by a boy who'd never come back. Jessica? Maya stood in the doorway. You okay? Jessica forced her practiced smile. Just tired. That's what you always say. Maya's voice was gentle. Kingsley seemed like a good one. He was a good one, Jessica thought. That was the problem. Kind, honest, decent. And after only a month, he'd looked at her across a restaurant table and admitted he couldn't feel it anymore. At least he'd been honest. At least he hadn't led her on. But honesty didn't stop the heartbreak. Jessica gathered her things and left, driving home through Chicago's November gray. Inside her Bronzeville apartment, beautiful, modern, empty, she finally let herself break. She sank to the floor back against the couch and pulled out the necklace. The silver star caught the lamplight, reflecting tiny points of brightness in the dimness. Where are you? She whispered to no one. Did you forget me? Did you forget your promise? She touched the scar on her left wrist. 14 stitches, faded now but still visible. 2 relics of a 15-year-old boy, a necklace and a scar. 20 years of waiting for someone who was never coming back. Jessica cried until exhaustion took her. Collapsing sideways on the floor, the necklace clutched in her fist. That same night in a Manhattan penthouse, Steve Douglas woke screaming from another nightmare, a girl's voice calling his name, her hand reaching for him across an impossible distance, and the crushing certainty that he'd broken a promise he couldn't remember making. Dr. Patricia Morrison had been Steve's therapist for 6 months. Ever since the dream started getting worse, she sat across from him now, her expression patient as he described the latest one. I'm standing in a park, Steve said, his leg bouncing restlessly. It's autumn, leaves everywhere. And there's this girl, I can never see her face clearly. But she's waving at me. Sometimes she's calling my name. Sometimes she's just standing there. And I know I'm supposed to remember something important. But I can't, and you wake up feeling like I've lost something precious. Like I've failed someone. His blue eyes met hers. Like I made a promise I haven't kept. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Steve, we've talked about your mother's death, your father's emotional absence, moving to New York with your uncle. But we've never really explored your time in Chicago before that, before you were 15. There's nothing to explore. I don't remember much. Maybe that's the problem. She leaned forward. These dreams started 9 months ago, yes? Right after your uncle passed. Steve nodded. His Uncle Richard had been more father to him than his own dad ever was. The loss had gutted him. Your uncle was your connection to your life after Chicago. Now he's gone, and your subconscious is trying to reconnect you to something from before, something unresolved. Dr. Morrison pulled out her prescription pad, but instead of writing medication, she wrote an address. Go back to Chicago. Visit your old neighborhood. Sometimes the places we come from hold the keys to understanding who we are. Steve looked at the address, his childhood home in Lincoln Park. I haven't been back in 20 years. I know. That's exactly why you need to go. The flight to Chicago felt surreal. Steve rented a car at O'Hare, drove through streets he half remembered, turned down roads that felt familiar in a way that made his chest tight. And then he saw it, Lincoln Park. The actual park, not just the neighborhood. His hands jerked the wheel without conscious thought, pulling into the parking lot. Steve sat in the car staring at the bare trees, the playground, the basketball court, and something inside him cracked wide open. A boy with a torn backpack, books scattered, laughter, cruel laughter, shame burning hot in his chest, tears he couldn't stop, and then her. A girl, small but fierce, stepping between him and the bullies. Leave him alone. Blood, so much blood on her wrist, her voice even through pain. I'm okay. Stop crying. I'll be okay. Oh my God, Steve whispered, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Jessica. The name unlocked everything. Memories flooded back with such force he couldn't breathe. Jessica, with her warm brown eyes and fierce spirit. Jessica, who'd been homeless, who'd saved him, who'd spent 2 weeks in a hospital because of him. Jessica, who he'd promised to come back for. Jessica, who he'd completely forgotten. No. Steve was out of the car, stumbling toward the park. His chest felt like it was caving in. How could he have forgotten? How could he have broken that promise? He remembered now, leaving for New York, his uncle's tough love approach. You need to move forward, Steve, not backward. Chicago is your past. Your future is here. Years of new schools, new friends, building a business, each day piling on top of the last until his childhood became a blur, until Jessica became just another forgotten memory. Except she hadn't forgotten him. He knew it with absolute certainty. Somewhere in this city, Jessica remembered. Jessica had waited, and he'd failed her. Steve stood in the middle of the park as the November sun set, and for the first time since he was 15 years old, he let himself cry. Not the silent tears of grief he'd shed for his uncle, but deep wrenching sobs for the promise he'd broken, for the girl who'd saved him, for 20 years of forgetting what mattered most. Back at his hotel that night, Steve couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and spoke to the empty room. I'm sorry, Jessica. God, I'm so sorry. I should have remembered. I should have come back. His voice broke. 20 years. You waited for me for 20 years, and I forgot you existed. But even as guilt consumed him, something else rose up, determination. He was here now. He remembered now. And he was going to find her, no matter what it took. The next morning, Steve started with Northwestern Hospital, where they'd taken her. The records department was sympathetic but unhelpful. Sir, we can't release patient information, especially from 20 years ago. She would have been admitted in November 2005. 13 years old, deep laceration on her left wrist, 14 stitches. The clerk typed, frowned. I'm showing a Jane Doe matching that description, but no Jessica William. Steve's heart sank, of course. She'd been a runaway, hiding from the system. She wouldn't have given her real name. Where did she go after discharge? I can't, please. Steve heard the desperation in his own voice. She saved my life. I need to find her. The clerk looked around, then scribbled something on a piece of paper. The discharge notes say she was transferred to Hope House. Children's home, that's all I can tell you. Steve spent the next week visiting every children's home, every social services office, every homeless shelter in Chicago. He showed them the only picture he had, his mother's necklace, the one he'd given Jessica. Have you seen anyone wearing this? A woman, 33 now, African-American, might have a scar on her left wrist. Dead end after dead end. Records were sealed. Memories were vague. 20 years was a long time. Every evening, Steve returned to the park. He sat on the same bench where he'd held her bleeding wrist, where she'd told him not to cry, and he waited. It was illogical. What were the chances she'd just happened to walk by? But he couldn't stop himself. Please, he prayed to whatever force might be listening. Please let me find her. I'll do anything. Just let me keep my promise. The dream stopped, but sleep eluded him anyway. Steve survived on coffee and determination, his business forgotten, his assistant calling frantically. From New York, nothing mattered except finding her. 2 weeks became 3. The lack of sleep was catching up with him. He felt it in the tremors in his hands, the way the world sometimes tilted unexpectedly, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after arriving in Chicago, Steve sat on his bench in the park as dusk settled. The temperature had dropped, promising the season's first snow. He should go back to the hotel, eat something, sleep. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered into the cold air, I'm here, Jessica. I came back. I know you probably hate me. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving until I find you. The world swam suddenly, nausea rolling through him. Steve gripped the bench, trying to steady himself, but his vision was darkening at the edges. Not now, he thought desperately. Please not. The seizure took him before he could finish the thought, and Steve Douglas collapsed onto the cold ground of the park, where his story with Jessica had begun, alone and unconscious, with no way of knowing that heaven was about to answer his prayer. Jessica's day had been endless. 3 back-to-back meetings about the new youth literacy program, a conference call with UNICEF headquarters in New York, and a site visit to a shelter on the South Side that left her emotionally drained. All she wanted was to go home, take a hot bath, and maybe finally respond to Lauren's increasingly persistent dinner invitations. But her car had other plans. The check engine light had been on for a week, and now the whole dashboard was lit up like a Christmas tree. Jessica pulled into a gas station, called her mechanic, and got the news she expected. It's going to take a couple hours at least. She stood outside the station, pulling her coat tighter against the November wind, and made a decision she'd been avoiding for weeks. The park was only a 15-minute walk from here. Her park, their park. Maybe it's time, she thought, touching the necklace under her scarf. Maybe seeing it again will help me let go. The sun was setting as she walked through the entrance, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The playground had been updated since her childhood, but the basketball court was the same, the benches were the same. Jessica's feet carried her to the spot where it had happened, where she'd fought 3 boys to save one. She sat on a bench nearby. Not the exact one. She couldn't bear that, and pulled out the necklace, letting it catch the dying light. The star pendant was tarnished, worn smooth from 20 years of constant touch. Stupid, she whispered to herself, holding on to a promise from a 15-year-old boy. What were you thinking, Jessica? A sound caught her attention, a thud like something heavy hitting the ground. Jessica stood looking around. There, maybe 30 feet away, near the basketball court, a man lay on the ground, his body convulsing. Training kicked in before thought. Jessica ran, dropping to her knees beside him. Seizure. She'd seen them before in her work, knew what to do. She turned him on his side, supporting his head, protecting it from the concrete. "Stay with me," she said firmly, her hand steady on his shoulder. "You're going to be okay. I've got you." People walked past, a jogger, a couple with a dog, and Jessica's anger flared. "Someone call 911, she shouted. A teenager finally pulled out his phone. The man's seizure lasted maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it ended, he lay still, unconscious, his breathing ragged. Jessica kept her hand on him, checking his pulse, making sure his airway was clear. In the fading light, she noticed his features. Sandy brown hair streaked with grey at the temples, strong jawline, probably mid-30s. Expensive suit, dirt-stained now. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. The ambulance arrived with sirens blaring. Paramedics rushed over. Asking questions, Jessica answered automatically. Seizure duration, whether he'd hit his head. Yes, she'd seen the whole thing. "Are you family?" one of them asked. "No, I just found him." "We should go," the paramedic said to his partner, already loading the man onto a gurney. Jessica stood preparing to leave, to go back to her broken-down car and her lonely apartment. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he'd looked so alone on the ground, the way people had walked past without helping. Maybe it was the voice in her head that sounded like her 13-year-old self. "Be the person who helps." "Which hospital?" she asked. "Northwestern." The word hit her like a physical blow. Northwestern. Where they'd taken her 20 years ago. Where Steve had visited her every day. "I'm coming with you," Jessica heard herself say. The paramedic looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, hop in." Northwestern's emergency room was controlled chaos. Jessica sat in the waiting area while they worked on the man, the stranger she'd saved. A nurse had taken her information. Jessica William Witness, Good Samaritan. An hour passed. Jessica checked her phone. Her mechanic had called twice. Her car was ready. She should leave. This wasn't her responsibility. But she stayed. Finally, a doctor emerged, still in his scrubs. "Miss William, I'm Dr. Patel, the man you helped, Mr. Douglas. He's stable." The seizure was triggered by severe sleep deprivation and stress. His body basically shut down. "Is he going to be okay?" "He'll be fine, thanks to you." If he'd been alone much longer, Dr. Patel smiled. "He's asking to see you, actually." "To thank you." Jessica followed the doctor down a corridor that felt achingly familiar. How many times had she walked these halls as a scared 13-year-old? They stopped at a room and Dr. Patel gestured her in. The man, Mr. Douglas, was sitting up in bed, looking exhausted but alert, and when his eyes met hers, Jessica felt the world tilt. Blue eyes, bright, piercing blue, even dulled by exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "The doctor said you stayed with me, came in the ambulance." "You didn't have to do that. I couldn't just leave you there." Jessica stayed near the door, suddenly uncomfortable. "Still, thank you." He was staring at her, and something in his gaze made her skin prickle. "I'm Steve Douglas." Jessica William. The name landed between them like a stone. Steve's entire body went rigid, his eyes widening, and Jessica watched color drain from his face. "Jessica," he whispered, and the way he said it, Like a prayer, like a sob, made her heart stutter. Before she could ask what was wrong, Steve reached out and gently took her hand. His fingers were shaking as he turned her wrist over, exposing the scar that ran across it. 14-stitch scar, faded now but still visible in the fluorescent light. Jessica tried to pull away, but Steve was staring at the scar like it was something sacred, tears streaming down his face. "How?" his voice broke. "How did you get this?" What? Why are you—" "Please," Steve said desperately. "Please tell me how you got this scar." Something in his intensity made Jessica answer. "I was 13. There was a boy being bullied in a park. I tried to help, and one of them had a knife. It was a long time ago." Steve made a sound like he'd been punched. His hand moved from her wrist to her neck, and before Jessica could process what was happening, he was touching the necklace, the one she never removed, the one that hung under her shirt. "May I?" he asked, and Jessica, too stunned to speak, nodded. Steve carefully pulled the necklace out, and when he saw the silver star pendant, he broke. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. Jessica stood frozen, confused, her heart pounding. "Mr. Douglas, I don't understand." "It's me," he choked out. "Jessica, it's me. I'm the boy you saved. I'm the one who gave you this necklace." The room spun. Jessica grabbed the wall for support, staring at this man, this stranger, trying to reconcile him with the 15-year-old boy from her memories. "That's not, you can't be." But even as she said it, she saw it. The blue eyes still the same. The way he'd cried over her wrist, just like he'd cried 20 years ago. The necklace he recognized instantly. "You said you'd come back," Jessica whispered, and suddenly she was angry. 20 years of waiting pouring out. "You promised. You said you'd come back for me, and you never did." "I forgot." Steve's voice was raw with anguish. "God forgive me, Jessica, I forgot. My uncle took me to New York, and he kept pushing me forward. And the years passed, and I forgot. I forgot the most important thing that ever happened to me." "You forgot me." The words came out flat dead. "No." Steve reached for her hand again, and this time Jessica let him take it. "My mind forgot, but my soul never did. I've been having dreams for months, you calling me, waving from a park I couldn't identify. Every woman I tried to date told me I wasn't really there, that I was searching for something. I was searching for you, Jessica. I just didn't remember what I was searching for." Jessica felt tears on her cheeks. 20 years of loneliness, of waiting, of broken hearts because no one could compare to a memory. All of it came crashing down. 3 weeks ago I came back to Chicago," Steve continued. "I drove past the park, and everything came back. Every memory, every promise. I've been searching for you every day since. Going to hospitals, orphanages, sitting in that park every evening praying you'd walk by." His voice broke again. "And tonight I had a seizure, because I haven't slept in weeks, because I've been so desperate to find you, and you found me instead." "Steve, I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry I forgot. I'm so sorry I made you wait. I'm so sorry for 20 years of breaking my promise. But I'm here now. I'm here, and I remember. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Jessica looked at him, really looked at him, at the tears streaming down his face, at the way he held her hand like she might disappear, at the genuine anguish in those blue eyes. This wasn't a man who'd abandoned her. This was a man who'd been lost and just found his way home. "You really didn't remember," she said softly. "Not until 3 weeks ago. But Jessica, even when I couldn't remember your name, couldn't remember your face, my soul was searching for you. Every relationship that failed, every dream that woke me up crying, every moment I felt like something was missing, it was you. It was always you." Jessica sat on the edge of his hospital bed, and without thinking she touched his face. Steve leaned into her palm like a man dying of thirst finding water. "I looked for you too," she admitted. "After I aged out of foster care, I went back to that park so many times. Tried to find records, but I didn't know your last name. Didn't know where in New York you'd gone." She touched the necklace. "This and this scar were all I had left of you." "I'm here now," Steve whispered. "I'm here and I'm never leaving you again." They sat there, foreheads pressed together, both crying, both holding on like the other might vanish. 20 years collapsed into this single moment. The promise broken and mended. The search ended. The wait finally over. Jessica breathed, her voice shaking. "I can't believe it's really you." "It's me, it's really me." Steve's hands trembled as they held her face, like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. Jessica pulled back just enough to look at him, really look at him. The boy she'd saved had become this man, weathered by time and success and loneliness. But those eyes, those blue eyes were the same. Still kind, still capable of tears. She whispered, "You came back." And it wasn't accusation anymore, just wonder. "I came back." Steve pulled her close again, and they held each other as the reality of it all crashed over them in waves. No words, just the sound of their breathing, their tears, their hearts finally beating in the same room, after 20 years apart. Dr. Patel found them like that an hour later, still holding on, afraid to let go. They talked through the night, filling in 20 years of gaps, sharing stories, marveling at the miracle of this reunion. When Dr. Patel came to discharge Steve in the morning, he found them asleep. Jessica curled up in the hospital bed beside Steve, their hands intertwined, the necklace gleaming between them. The promise written in heaven all those years ago had finally been kept. Jessica's apartment had never felt like home until Steve walked into it. She watched him take in her space. The photos of children she'd helped lining one wall, the bookshelves overflowing with reports and novels, the large windows overlooking the city. Anne felt suddenly vulnerable. "It's beautiful," Steve said softly, turning to her. "It's so you. You don't even know me anymore," Jessica said. But there was no bite to it, just wonder. "We're strangers who used to know each other as children." Steve crossed the space between them, cupping her face gently. "Then let's get to know each other again. We have time now, all the time in the world." That first week was surreal. Steve stayed at his hotel but came to her apartment every evening after she finished work. They cooked together, or tried to, laughing when Steve admitted he'd survived on takeout for years. They talked for hours, sharing everything. Jessica told him about her years in foster care, about finding UNICEF, about pouring herself into saving children, because she knew what it felt like to need saving. Steve told her about building his business, about the emptiness that came with success, about relationships that failed because he was always searching for something he couldn't name. "It was you," he said one night, sitting on her couch with her feet in his lap. "Every woman I dated, I was comparing them to a ghost I couldn't remember. No one ever measured up, because they weren't you." Jessica traced the scar on her wrist absently. "I did the same thing. Every man who tried to love me, I kept waiting to feel what I felt when I was 13. That certainty, like I'd found something precious." "And did you? Feel it with anyone else?" Never, she met his eyes. Not once in 20 years. Steve brought her hand to his lips, kissing the scar. "I'm so sorry you had to wait alone." "You're here now," Jessica whispered. "That's what matters." 3 weeks after the hospital, Steve stood in Jessica's kitchen, drying dishes while she washed. It was domestic, simple, and somehow more intimate than any date at a fancy restaurant could have been. Steve said, smiling, "You have soap on your nose." Jessica reached up to wipe it, but Steve caught her hand. "Let me." He stepped closer, using his thumb to gently brush away the suds. But his hand lingered, cupping her cheek, and suddenly neither of them was breathing. "Jessica," he whispered, and everything in that one word, longing, question, permission, she answered by closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly this time, tentative, like they were both afraid of breaking something precious. Steve's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer, and Jessica's hands slid up to his neck, fingers threading through his hair. The kiss deepened, 20 years of waiting finally finding release. It was gentle and fierce all at once, familiar and brand new, like finding something you didn't know you'd lost. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Steve pressed his forehead to hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the hospital," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" "Because I wanted to do it right. Not in some sterile room. Not when we were both crying and broken." His thumb traced her jaw. "I wanted to kiss you when we were just us. Jessica and Steve, home." Jessica smiled, pulling him down for another kiss. "We're home now." "Yeah," Steve breathed against her lips. "We finally are." 2 months in, Steve told her he was moving his business headquarters to Chicago. Jessica sat across from him at a small Ethiopian restaurant, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "What? Steve, you can't just—" "I can, and I am." His blue eyes were fierce with certainty. "New York has nothing for me. It never did. Everything I want is here. You're here, but your business will adapt. Most of my work is remote anyway. The board already approved it. He reached across the table, taking her hand. I'm not losing you again, Jessica. Not for anything. Jessica felt tears prick her eyes. No one had ever chosen her like this. No one had ever rearranged their entire life just to be near her. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of this being too good. Of waking up one day and you're gone. Of, her voice broke, of you getting bored of me. Steve stood, came around the table, and pulled her up into his arms right there in the middle of the restaurant. Other diners stared, but he didn't care. Listen to me, he said fiercely. I searched for you for 3 weeks without sleeping. I had a seizure because my body gave out before my determination did. Do you really think I'm going to walk away from you now that I've found you? People leave, Jessica whispered against his chest. Everyone always leaves. I'm not everyone. Steve pulled back, making her look at him. Our love was written in heaven before we even met, Jessica. I gave you my mother's necklace when I was 15, because even then, my soul knew you were my forever. Some promises are bigger than us. Some bonds can't be broken, even by 20 years and 1,000 miles. Jessica sobbed against him and Steve held her, let her cry out 20 years of abandonment and fear. Right there in a restaurant in Chicago, while a patient waiter pretended not to notice. I love you, he whispered. I love you too. Steve bought a house in Lincoln Park, a beautiful renovated brownstone with a garden Jessica immediately fell in love with. He hired movers, brought his life from New York, and never once complained about leaving everything behind. You're my everything, he told her when she expressed guilt. The rest is just stuff. 4 months in, Jessica brought him to a UNICEF event. She was nervous. This was her world, her colleagues, her life's work. Steve wore a perfectly tailored suit and charmed everyone he met. But what made Jessica's heart swell was watching him with the children. A little girl named Amara, shy and clinging to Jessica's leg, somehow ended up in Steve's arms, giggling as he made terrible jokes. Jessica watched him, and something clicked into place. You're good with kids, she said later, in the car ride home. Steve glanced at her, a soft smile on his face. I'd like to have them someday, with you, if that's something you want. Jessica's hand found the necklace at her throat. I've spent my whole life saving other people's children. I never let myself think about having my own. Why not? Because I was waiting for you, she said simply, and I didn't know if you'd ever come back. Steve pulled the car over, right there on Lakeshore Drive, and kissed her until they were both breathless. I'm here, he said against her lips. I'm here and I'm staying. And yes, Jessica William, I want children with you. I want everything with you. 6 months after their reunion, Steve took Jessica back to the park. It was May now, spring painting everything green and gold. He led her to the bench where he'd sat every night, searching for her. I almost gave up, he admitted, sitting down and pulling her beside him. After 2 weeks of searching, I was so tired, so hopeless. But every night I'd come here and I'd pray. I'd say, please just let me find her. Let me keep my promise. I was home that night, Jessica said, crying on my floor, holding your necklace, ready to give up on love entirely. And then I had a seizure, and you saved me again. Steve turned to face her fully. You've saved me twice now, Jessica. Once when we were children. Once when we were lost adults trying to find our way back to each other. Steve, he slid off the bench onto one knee, and Jessica's breath caught. You saved me, and now I want to spend the rest of my life saving you back. From loneliness, from heartbreak, from ever doubting that you're loved completely and eternally. He pulled out a ring, a simple band with a star-shaped diamond, an echo of the necklace she wore. Jessica William, will you marry me? Will you let me keep the promise I made when I was 15? Will you give me the honor of being your husband, your partner, your home? Jessica was crying, nodding before he even finished. Yes, yes, Steve, yes. The ring slid onto her finger perfectly, like it had been made for her, like everything in their lives had been leading to this moment. Steve stood, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her as the sunset painted the sky the same colors. It had been 20 years ago when they first met. Around them, people in the park applauded, but neither of them heard. They were lost in each other, in the miracle of finding what was lost, in the promise finally kept. They married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Jessica wore a simple white dress, and the silver necklace, Steve's mother's necklace, gleamed at her throat. Steve cried when he saw her walking toward him, and Jessica cried too, both of them messy and emotional and completely in love. Maya stood as her maid of honor, David Chen stood as Steve's best man, but the real witnesses were the children from Jessica's UNICEF programs, who threw flower petals and cheered when Steve kissed his bride. In his vows, Steve said, "I lost you once through forgetting. I found you again through grace. I will never, ever let you go again. You are my home, my heart, my reason. Every scar tells a story, and ours tells the greatest love story ever written." In her vows, Jessica said, "You gave me a necklace when we were children and told me you'd come back. I held on to that promise for 20 years, even when it seemed foolish. But love isn't foolish. Faith isn't wasted. You came back just like you promised. And now I promise you, I will love you every day for the rest of my life. I will be your home the way you've become mine." 1 year after their wedding, Jessica stood in the nursery of their Lincoln Park home, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Steve came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, his hands covering hers. "Luna and Stella," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her neck. "Moon and star, like the necklace, like the promise," Jessica corrected, leaning back against him. "Written in heaven." The twins came 3 weeks later, 2 perfect girls with their mother's warm brown skin and their father's bright blue eyes. Steve held them both, one in each arm, tears streaming down his face as Jessica watched from the hospital bed. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for giving me this family, this life, this love." Jessica touched the necklace at her throat, the one she'd worn for 21 years now. "Through heartbreak and hope, through waiting and finding. It was written in heaven," she said softly. "Before we were born, before we met, before any of it. Our souls knew. They've always known." Steve brought the girls to her, and they became a family. Born from a promise made by children, broken by time and mended by fate. The scar on Jessica's wrist had brought them together twice. The necklace had kept them connected through 20 years of separation. And now, in their home filled with love and laughter, with 2 daughters, who would grow up knowing they were born from a miracle, Steve and Jessica finally had their happy ending, or rather, their beautiful beginning. Every evening when Steve came home from work, he'd find Jessica in the nursery with Luna and Stella. He'd wrap his arms around all 3 of them, and in those moments, he'd remember the 15-year-old boy who'd made a promise he couldn't keep alone. But heaven had kept it for him. Heaven had remembered when he forgot. Heaven had brought them back together in a park, with a seizure and a scar, and a necklace that had waited 20 years to fulfill its purpose. Some love stories end, but the ones written in heaven, those love stories never really end at all. They just keep beginning, over and over in every sunrise, every heartbeat, every moment 2 souls choose each other again. And Steve and Jessica chose each other every single day, for the rest of their lives. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end. I truly appreciate every moment you spent here. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Until next time, keep your heart open and keep believing in the power of love.